Well, thanks for joining us today for this Blueprint webinar. We are going to quickly recap what we learned during the 2026 legislative session, and we've got a couple of guests to reflect on the legislative session and what they're seeing in their communities. But we'll go ahead and get kicked off. My name is Shannon Moody with Kentucky Youth Advocates. I'm our Chief Policy and Strategy Officer here at KYA. And we're also joined by Liz McQuillen, the Chief Policy Officer at Metro United Way, Shane Noem, he's the president and founder of Roebling Solutions, and then Nickie Jones, the Executive Director of Family Enrichment Center. We are going to tag them in a little bit to hear from them directly on what they heard and saw during the legislative session. But before we do that, I'm going to just briefly recap some of our blueprint priorities, what we saw as wins, as well as reflect a little bit on our 2-year state budget. And then we'll dive in and hear from our panelists. I'm really excited about the conversation today. We've got fantastic folks who have a lot to offer and share with our listeners, and looking forward to the conversation. So just really quickly wanted to recap what we saw this legislative session. It was a busy one. Again, it was a 60-day session, a budget session. So we saw 1,293 bills and filed during this legislative session. There were a lot of bills coming out of both chambers, definitely more we see come out of the House, just sheer number of members there. Kentucky Youth Advocates analyzed 526 of those bills and looked at the impact on Kentucky's kids. Now, we know not all of those bills advance, and I know the folks around our virtual table have also dug into several other bills that we probably did not review here at KYA, and so we'll talk a little bit about those. What we do know is that every year we see on average 10 to 15% of bills filed that get passed and moved into the process to become a law. This year was no different. We saw 174 bills passed through both chambers and were either signed, vetoed, and then overrode, or they became law without a signature, which is about 13.5% passage rate. The good news is that all blueprint policy priorities received a bill number and had a bill filed with a sponsor. So we see a clear commitment to Kentucky's kids every time we have a legislator who is willing to engage and do the work to file a bill and sponsor a bill. So that, I think, generated a lot of hopefulness when it comes to kid advocacy. Sometimes that alone is a win. But we did see some solid wins. This legislative session, we saw 3 blueprint policy priority wins and 1 budget win based on what we had outlined at the beginning of the legislative session on our agenda. What we also saw this legislative session were bills that were good for kids. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what those wins were, but then also what we're hoping to see maybe in the coming sessions get refiled and move through the process. Those 3 blueprint policy wins were House Bill 253, sponsored by Representative James Tipton. That was actually a literacy bill, good for kids, but also another component of that bill was around educator sexual misconduct. And what we've been working on with the Face It movement over the last couple of years with Representative Tipton, which is ensuring that we are not using non-disclosure agreements when there's sexual misconduct involved between a school employee and a student or minor, appropriate background and reference checks, and then training for public and private school employees. We know that school is often a place for kids to be safe and supported by adults. We have many, many adults who are committed to keeping kids safe and healthy and well. But we do need to make sure that when there are situations where adults are not creating safety for kids, there are ways to ensure that that is addressed and put an end to. Another fantastic win that we saw with some real progress around creating access to quality childcare was House Bill 6. That's Representative Samara Heverin. I know that Liz McQuillen and Shane and Nickie all probably will have some ideas and insight on what that means for them when it comes to kids in our most in our youngest families. But what we do know is that a component of that bill was around ensuring that young children with special needs are better supported by our child care providers because they will be able to get access to training and will be required to do training around supporting children with disabilities. And we're glad to see that because we know that kids with disabilities are at a greater risk of expulsion and are at a greater risk of child abuse and neglect, unfortunately. And then another win that we saw, and this was a couple of years in the making, is Senate Bill 122 with Senator Julie Rocky Adams. I know Representative Nick Wilson also worked on this bill, but it allows for a consideration of alternative sentencing options for individuals who've committed non-violent offenses and they are the primary caregiver to a dependent child. We know in Kentucky we have high rates of parental incarceration. The more that we can keep families together in community and still being held accountable for decisions that they're made, the better off the parent and child are, and the community is in general. So Senate Bill 122 passed this year finally. We were really glad to see that. And then lastly, that budget win that we had discussed earlier is around kinship care. We know that relative caregivers, relative and fictive kin caregivers step up to take care of kids and as an alternative to foster care. We also know that it takes money to raise kids, and we need to make sure that those placements are sustained and stable. And we need to do that by ensuring that we've got appropriate supports, financial supports, and other supports for kinship families that are stepping up to do that. This also should address some of the issues that we had seen in previous sessions around Senate Bill 151. There were several other blueprint policy priorities that were filed, as I had mentioned, related to eviction and expunging filings around eviction dismissals, prohibiting minors from being named on evictions. We also saw a bill filed related to supporting youth well-being by directing social media settlement dollars for positive youth development programs. Unfortunately, those did not pass, but we're hopeful that we'll see in the future some work around those. We also saw some common sense bills related to utility disconnections during extreme weather events. We also saw a bill filed related to addressing legal rights of children by requiring minors to speak with juvenile attorneys before they waive their Miranda rights to address that juvenile justice population. We also saw some legislation filed around family impact statements and analyzing how proposed legislation would impact kids and families. In addition to that, we saw bills filed related to dual settlement funds to direct those towards prevention and cessation. Unfortunately, that did not go this year. We also saw a bill filed related to improving legal representation for children and families in the child welfare system with Representative Stephanie Dietz for House Bill 598. And then bills related to diaper need and paid family leave for our youngest kiddos across the state. Those did not get across the finish line, but we're hopeful. And we see a real commitment to addressing the needs of kids and families through the filing of these bills. And then finally, because it was a budget year, we had identified a couple of budget priorities, and we'll dig into what those what we saw as positives that came out of the budget with Liz and Shane briefly here. But some of the priorities that we had identified within our blueprint for Kentucky's children was to ensure that youth who are in the foster care system are supported by automatically issuing state IDs at no cost to youth in foster care and creating some supports for that. Also, an investment in parent engagement meetings, which we know help to address chronic absenteeism and can lead to reducing truancy issues later on. And then also investment in supervised parenting time to ensure that families who are involved in the child welfare system have access to that supervised visitation to help further support reunification efforts down the road. So we know it was an interesting session. We saw a budget get passed very last minute. And there were a lot of things still being decided within the final hours of the budget and on some policy issues. Shane, I'd like to start with you. Do you want to reflect a little bit on some of those budget wins or what you saw as budget wins this 2026 session?
Sure thing. And thank you, Shannon. I just want to say Shannon and her entire team at KYA did a fantastic job this session. It's not easy following the General Assembly from start to sine die, but they did it and did it with grace and poise and got a lot of things accomplished. Well, we talked about the budget process. It's not easy to do a budget. It's not easy to do a budget in good years. It's not easy to do a budget even when it's one party control. And that showed this year. And so a lot of the priorities that came out, we saw record levels of education funding across the state. We saw new funding streams going into health initiatives. And so I think what we started to see is this General Assembly really focusing on long-term health and education priorities. In Louisville, in particular, House Bill 900 was the one-time spending. You had 9 million to the Kids Center for Pediatric Therapies and capital expansion. You had another 1.3 million to the West End Louisville Literacy and Numeracy Project, and that was through U of L, and another 1 million for the Bluegrass Center for Autism. So you're seeing these comprehensive, long-term strategic investments that are really looking at the next generation and the generation beyond, and not just keeping things funded at what they're doing. The the appropriators had a heck of a task this year. There were federal constraints coming down. There's inflation nationwide, and so they had to do a lot more with a lot less. We've heard a lot about the the race to zero on the income tax, but we didn't hit the metrics, so we're not going to see that again. So there was a lot of thought being put into this finite amount of money that we've got. How do we spend it? And I think we've got a lot of wins to be pointing to. The other thing I want to say is looking at the priorities, and these aren't necessarily budget related, but this gets a sense of where legislators are thinking. House Bill 1 through 9 and Senate Bill 1 through 9, those are priorities for the leadership, for all the members. And over half of the Senate priority bills were education related. House Bill 1 in the House was education related. There were a lot of health ones in there. So as we're wondering, are they political? Where's their head at? They're truly looking at what's going to be benefiting kids and families for the next generation.
Liz, any reflections from you on the budget as far as what you saw as wins or things to celebrate?
Yeah, well, first I want to echo what Shane said. And it's always a pleasure to work with the KYA team on so many priorities during the session. And yeah, it felt like the budget was a little bit more obscure for a little bit longer during this long budget session. And we didn't get to see it until a little bit later. But obviously, there were some really big ticket items that they were focused on with less resources to do that. So Medicaid was a huge topic of discussion this session. Obviously, it's going to be a huge portion of the budget, even as they try to reduce costs and they implement changes of HR 1. While that's not always the focus of our work at Metro United Way, obviously it has a big implications for the kids and the families that we serve that need those safety net programs. And I think they tried to really walk a line to make sure the vulnerable families that need those programs that they can exist while also trying to keep down costs. So as Shane was talking about priority bills, House Bill 2, that was the big, obviously a priority legislation that was the Medicaid overhaul. And so, obviously one of the big wins for us, and you mentioned this as one of the blueprint priorities, was House Bill 6. And so we were really pleased to see where that ended up in the budget, particularly when you look at the constraints of this budget for the upcoming fiscal years. We actually ended up, in 2024, we had historic investment in childcare with about 124 million of general fund dollars over the biennium, and we were really excited about that. And then we topped that this year with about, what was it, 135 million over the biennium. So really excited to see that investment and that championship and recognition of how important childcare is as an infrastructure for working families and for the economy in Kentucky. So those were big wins in the budget that we were excited to celebrate.
Yeah, for sure. And I know the House especially, but both chambers, I think, had identified childcare as a real clear priority and recognizing that as a need for families who are trying to go to work or finish school. And I think we should all feel really glad to see what resulted with the budget investments there. And at the at the very least, we were hoping for them to sustain and for the additional investment that shows real clear sign that they're listening to their constituents about affordability and what's really needed in order for families to be economically secure. I know that there was a lot of worry going into this budget about cuts because we were hearing, we did not hit we did not hit the markers for the income tax. We also were seeing less revenue come in than we had in previous years, and then no COVID dollars. So, we obviously did see cuts to some things across the board. Education was held safe. I think law enforcement was held safe, but there were some smaller cuts to other programs, and I think we'll see what happens over the coming months and years to how that's going to really play out in our communities and affect us. But I think we should all feel really glad to see what did shake out overall, because I think there's a lot of worry, rightfully so, but I think we're in a better position than a lot of advocates thought we might be. So let's start with the good. We talked a little bit about some of those positives in the budget, but let's also talk about what came out of the legislative session that you're feeling either excited or hopeful about. Feeling free to give some shout outs to legislative champions that we saw kind of ascend during this legislative session or maintain their, kid advocate status. I know, we might not want to single out a legislator, but you can also feel free. But like, what would you see as a top area for kudos or real hopefulness or positivity come out of this legislative session? Shane, would you like to kick us off with that?
Yeah, and at the risk of being a little redundant of some of the priorities I highlighted, I want to single out Representative Heverin and her House Bill 6. We can talk about this for days and weeks, and we should. This is transformational in the state for childcare, and partially what it does, but partially how all the allies and advocates and partners came to the table. The Chamber of Commerce was a big piece of this. We're not talking about childcare as those nice people that take care of our kids. It's now this is a backbone industry in Kentucky that we see as a vital part of the ecosystem. I mean, just some of the things that came out of that: free childcare for childcare workers. I mean, that's at the crux of what we're talking about here. Subsidies for the CCAP program had some changes and modifications. Certified childcare communities, there's now a framework for that program. Licensure for micro centers, we're seeing a huge push for that. And then, as mentioned earlier, the training for interacting with kids with special needs. I think this is just the first of several sessions we're going to talk about childcare legislation, but this was the water over the dam moment where legislators have enough of a grasp on it. They understand where the industry and the advocates are coming from, and I think this ball is going to keep rolling.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's helpful to remember that our legislators are coming in. This is a part-time, non-professional legislature, so they're coming in with whatever professional background they have, but it's usually not the areas that they're necessarily working on. So they spend a lot of time studying up and figuring out what they need to learn in order to make some changes. Liz, what did you see as a need for kudos or bright spots?
Yeah, I have to piggyback off what Shane said about Rev Heverin, and that she has just been such a dogged champion for childcare and for such a long time too, and that she has really gone door to door with her colleagues to talk about childcare and about House Bill 6, and we really started to see some movement in that in the vote counts for House Bill 6. We saw some movement for people who a couple of years ago might not have would not have voted for this bill, or might have had some real ideological differences just about government spending on childcare, and really are starting to see it differently. As Shane said, like, this is an economic issue. This is a workforce issue in Kentucky. And so, she has just been just an amazing champion, and has really taken the work of that Kentucky Collaborative on Childcare and just taken it to the next level. We could not be here without her. And what Shane said, the free childcare for childcare providers, that's something that Kentucky has been doing in practice since 2022, but now it is codified. It is in law. So that's something that we will have to continue doing. It's been amazingly successful. So that's a really big win in that bill as well. You had mentioned, Shannon, Representative Nick Wilson with Senate Bill 122. He had the companion bill for that in the House with the Family Preservation and Accountability Act. He really, really worked that bill in the House, and I think has really started to emerge as a champion for families and children. And I'm excited about sort of other issues that we can rely on him for in the future. And then I also want to give a shout out to Representative Susan Whitten with House Bill 338, the eviction expungement bill. This bill was really narrowly tailored for, of course, evictions that were dismissed, or for evictions that were, in error placed for minors. And she was just an incredible sponsor for this bill and was working it until the very last minute of session, until like 11 p.m. on signing day. And was, just very, very passionate about this. And I fully expect her to take this back up in the future. So she has really sort of stepped up and has always been a great sponsor for things like this. So I think we've started to see the other thing that I was really excited about at this session is it really felt like lawmakers were really focused on issues that really affect Kentucky families, right? We talked about education. We talked about these safety net programs. We're talking about childcare. We're talking about housing. We didn't get as far as in housing as I hoped we would have, but we saw a lot of bills filed and we saw significant movement. So they were taking up really serious issues and working on them and building consensus. So I was really encouraged to see them just take these issues that are so important to Kentucky families and focus on those.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be hopeful about for sure. I know Shane and Liz are experts in this and are in Frankfurt regularly. They're actively working on policy, and that's their wheelhouse. And I know, Nickie, this is for you something that you all are really interested in, passionate about, but you're coming at it from a different perspective. What did you see this session, though, that you thought was worth lifting up based on the work that you all did?
Yeah, so I thank you, and I am honored to be asked to even be on here and speak. I feel like, honestly, since post-COVID, I've been shouting this as loud as I could that childcare matters, and I'm really glad to see, like you all said, the House Bill 6. That's big for us, and I'm hopeful that the bills passed this session not only raise awareness for child abuse, but put into action some real activities that make children safer. And I can tell you here locally, because we run a child care, we are seeing an increasing need for children with behavior issues, special needs, and our providers are just yearning for that training. And we've been, so anytime that we can improve the quality of care and accessibility for our youngest babies, it's a win in our books. And so I'm so grateful for our local legislators that did support this bill. And I'm excited to see about the expansion of the access to quality in rural areas and the non-traditional hours. Again, this bill for me, and there are many more, but this bill for me was just life-changing for the childcare world. And to have those concrete supports for families to prevent child abuse, it's affordability. It's what keeps families working. And it's a foundational pillar for economic development. So that's my part about this whole hopeful piece to what's to come.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of impact that childcare has across um, the ecosystem, right? It's good to make sure that families have quality childcare so that they can get to work. Kids are safer in quality childcare. There's more stability. There's opportunity there. So for sure, glad to see so much work and emphasis put around that piece, especially this legislative session, as well as education and housing. I would reflect Liz's sentiments. Would have loved to see more move through, but sometimes good policy takes longer than we want it to, and we have to continue to figure out how to navigate and work across the chambers and work across the aisles to make sure that that becomes a reality. So, kind of a segue into that is it's been a weird session. I think there's been a lot of conversation about how, legislators had a lot of tough decisions on the budget, had tough decisions on some of our policy priorities that were filed. But we've heard advocates kind of reflect that this was an odd session. But I've also heard folks talk about how it seems like every session has been odd or weird the last couple of years. Thoughts on what made it weird and why? Like, or is there another way you would describe this session? Why did it feel so different than previous sessions?
Well, I mean, I think they're all their own weird animal. This whole process is just kind of odd. It's not a normal, business process. It's so collaborative and so open. I would break the weirdness this session down into two camps. One is structural and one is political. Structural, a couple things happened. We all heard about the tragedy in Minnesota where legislators were shot, one was assassinated. So there are new security procedures at the Capitol. The Senate floor is now locked down the same way the House is, so you have to check in. You can't just pop into senators' offices. So that was different. I think I think it's the right thing to do, but that just changed it a little. The other is the Capitol's closed for between 5 to 10 years, some say. We don't really know until they get in there and do the structural work on the dome. But we don't have the gathering spaces we used to. We don't have the flood of students coming down and buses to do tours of the Capitol. So that was just weird. There's a temporary chambers built next to the annex. So now legislators go from their office to the floor and back, and we don't get to harass them as they're walking over to the Capitol building. So again, that's probably okay, but it's just different and weird. And then on the political side, I'll say two things. One, it really all revolves around one thing. It's no secret that Governor Bashir is running for president. And whether you love him or not, that has an impact on the legislative process. And there's been this tit for tat of who really controls the budgeting process. I think it was 2 years ago, the appropriators in the House decided they were going to release their budget first, even though the governor's formally supposed to send recommendations to the House, and then they're supposed to light his budget on fire and do what they want. They went ahead and went rogue. Well, this year, the governor's office was a little more coy on sharing numbers and communications, and that resulted in appropriators actually issuing subpoenas to the executive branch to get their numbers. And there's a lot of speculation on why, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of this comes down to he's running for president. They're either playing gotcha or he thinks they're playing gotcha, and there's just this tension. And that tension is not always good. Sometimes it's fine and doesn't hurt the long-term outcomes. But that definitely made it a weird start to the budget session.
Yeah, I'll second that. It's just difficult as advocates and Metro United Way is a nonpartisan. I'm a nonpartisan lobbyist. And so we work with the political landscape that is in place. But there is a lot of tension, and it does make things just tricky when you are trying to just advocate for good policy and you want the best information. Sometimes that's hard to get. And sometimes it just gets in the way of good policy when you're navigating these things. And so that's always difficult.
My word would be overwhelming. I believe I saw a screenshot of everything that was introduced and I'm like, oh my goodness. And I was so glad to be a partner because honestly, as a smaller nonprofit, we're in the weeds. So to be able to have groups like KYA and the Face It Legislative Committee that really keeps us on top of the priorities and where they are, and then us doing our part to support that is just is wonderful. And so that's my word.
I would also reflect overwhelming was certainly a word I used during the legislative session, especially as we got closer to the end. At the beginning, it felt a little underwhelming because nothing was moving and there were no committees meeting. So we were just kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. Nickie, I appreciate your reflections on, being a smaller nonprofit, relying on some of our advocacy partners to gain information about the work. But at the root of the work is kids and families who are living and growing in communities. And Family Enrichment Center, you all get a daily dose of contact with our families that you all serve through your childcare program, parents as teachers, little learners, parenting supports and adoption supports. I know Metro United Way also, like obviously you all do advocacy work, but engage folks in the community in many different ways as well. How do you see some of the politics or the legislative session processes impacting families in your community? Are you seeing an impact? What does that look like for you all, Nickie?
Well, I think, we believe that all families want their children to grow up healthy and safe. And that includes just meeting the basic needs of food and medical care, as well as affordable child care. But when your families are forced to choose food for my kids versus care, there really is no choice. So, I'm glad to see some of the movement and things that happened this time with that to support those families. But, I go back to I can't help but just harp on House Bill 6 because, you know, families are struggling with, um, you know, just their children with special needs. And I think they find us as a resource, a support, a concrete support for their children who are experiencing these crises. And for us to be able to help them navigate through the issues that they're facing while also to maintain a safe and healthy home, we're doing that. And so the other thing is, we actively seek grant funding to help support families with these with children when the medical insurance doesn't cover it. We're allowing providers to come into our child care, which some child cares do not do that, but we're allowing them to come into our child care to support families any way that we can because we realize that children and families need this so that they feel supported. They feel that, that they're getting access to services that they may not be getting. And we don't want to wait till children get all the way to school before they're supported in this way. So, we're just grateful to be here and to help support families and especially those who are really high risk because majority of our kids that attend our child care are at risk or have already been abused. So that's what we're seeing on the grassroots level.
Yeah, and for Metro United Way, we're coming up on 108 years old, and for most of that time, we have mostly been a grant-making organization, and we do a lot of programmatic work. Our policy and advocacy work is newer to our organization, but we got involved in that work because we believe that what policy has built, programming alone cannot transform. And so the policy work that we're involved in is directly tied to the programming work that we're involved in. And so, we operate our 211 call center, which is, resource navigation. We do that in the greater Louisville region, but the United Ways throughout Kentucky are covered. We cover all 120, the local United Ways throughout Kentucky cover all 120 counties. And so the data that we're seeing, at least in our region, the top three requests that we get are for housing, for rental assistance or utility assistance, and then food. And so those are generally always the top three. But what we're seeing over the past 6 to 12 months are just an uptick in the volume of calls, right? So we know that those basic needs are always there, but they continue to grow. And so, I mean, that underpins our work. And so we know, so that's how we always balance. We know that we need a strong safety net for the families who need it right now, but we also need to grow these policy opportunities so that families have not just like to meet their immediate needs, but so that they have opportunities, so that they can access, career pathways and can have these opportunities to really support themselves and their families and make their own decisions and have their own autonomy. So that's sort of how we balance it. But what we're really seeing on the ground is that, and you mentioned this, Shannon, there's just a lot of uncertainty right now for families, and that's sort of representative, Shane, and how you talked about the budget for the state. I mean, I think families are really seeing that in their own finances, right? People are just feeling a lot of uncertainty and a crunch right now, especially when it comes to housing cost. Housing instability is a really big issue in our region and across the state. So those are things that we're really focusing on and will continue to work on at the state level and at the local level.
Yeah. And I just want to say the work that Family Enrichment Center, KYA, United Way all do, what they're doing is really making Kentucky a better place to live, work, and raise a family. And the policies they're advocating for, I mean, these are things that impact everybody. I've got 3 kids. I've got a 7-year-old, 14-year-old, and a 16-year-old, and I want them all to stay in Kentucky after they go out and have their own life. Ultimately it's up to them, but I want Kentucky to be as competitive as possible for them to want to be here. And the policies that they're advocating for are getting us closer to that.
Appreciate that, Shane, and all of the help that you provide us advocates and especially with KYA and serving on our board. So we're definitely appreciative. I know that it's hard to focus on the retrospective when we're also looking ahead and seeing a lot of potential changes happening in the coming months and years. Primaries are coming up. A key congressional seat is open after almost over 3 decades with Senator McConnell, a real advocate for Kentucky's kids, that we saw him actively work for Kentucky during his time spent in Congress. And we have a gubernatorial election coming up as well. So there's a lot of things coming that feel really momentous or transitional, at least. So as an advocate, how are you staying focused, and what are you going to be focusing on for your organization in the coming months and years? Liz, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Well, I think it's always an opportunity when when there are, new legislators, new representatives coming in. Obviously, we've had a lot of turnover in the General Assembly over the past, 5 or 6 years. And it's an opportunity. It's also a challenge because you have to educate, these are part-time legislators, you have to educate them on the issues that matter to you, and you have to make the case of why it matters to their constituents and why it matters to the state. But it's also an opportunity to sort of gain champions, right? What we are sort of looking at is what are the issues, particularly at the state level, that are things that we can move in the next couple of sessions, and then what are the issues that we really just sort of need to wait and might not really be in play until we have a new governor. Things like paid family leave. We know that that's a tricky issue right now. We have Governor Beshear had sort of issued a reg around paid family leave. We had hoped to get some legislation that's a little bit more family friendly, that's accessible more than once every 10 years for state employees. But it's unlikely to happen, I think probably while he is still in office. So those are sort of the things that we're looking at. So really just seeing like what issues are in play, and then what things do we sort of need to put on the back burner until maybe we have some different players in place. And then the other thing, you know, we do a lot of work at Metro United Way and Louisville, at the Louisville Metro Council, and we've got a lot of churn happening there. We have nonpartisan elections for the first time. We have a mayoral race. So a lot happening there. And again, we just really want to focus on the issues. We're trying to make sure that we're doing, as a nonpartisan organization, we're partnering with other organizations and hosting like candidate forums that are focused on specific issues like housing. So obviously we don't endorse candidates, but we can ask them about the issues that matter to us and then find out what their answers are and inform, you know, our constituencies in that way. So that's how we're approaching the upcoming elections and cycles that are coming up. But also really interested to hear Shane's perspective on this, because he's really the pro here when it comes to the political landscape.
Well, I was wondering if I was going to behave during this, but now you've opened the floodgates. Well, it's Derby week, right? So this is the season to be putting your money on the line and making bets on a winning race. And so I think that's the spin I'm going to take is it's campaign season. There's a primary, 20 days away or however long. And then November, we've got some big races. Mild Boss is hanging it up, as you mentioned. Senator McConnell had a great run. The two odds-on favorites to replace him are Daniel Cameron and Andy Barr. They're on the Republican side, and then it's most likely a Republican will hold that seat in the fall. So I would say we should be focusing on building relationships with them if we don't have those already. The same goes for there's a congressional seat in Northern Kentucky, but also looking ahead to the governor's race. You know, Congressman Comer, there was an article in a poll that came out this week. He seems really far ahead early on. He's got great name ID, and the landscape looks to be favoring him. I would be looking at who our advocates are that have good relationships with him. And then, Liz, you mentioned the local elections. We cannot rule out these local races. Whether it's school board, city council, fiscal court, sheriffs, they all have a hand in implementing, making policy that impacts kids and families. And so I think we need to be looking at these races all across the board and encouraging and helping and supporting good people that want to implement good policy for families.
I always appreciate learning from both of you and from you, Nickie. What are you all focused on?
Kind of the same thing, other just on a smaller scope, right? But just working with local and state organizations to promote concrete supports for child abuse prevention, and we will continue to educate our local legislators on and our local government. I'm glad Shane brought that up. I mean, they do make policy, and so we want to bring them into our agency, talk to them, and we've had some visitors in the past, so. We're good friends with some of them, and then just really keep our staff, our board who have impact too, to vote, to know the priorities and care about them, you know. And so sometimes they may get that maybe they're not up to what's going on in our area and how it can impact local nonprofits and just youth serving organizations. So that's what we plan to do for sure.
Yeah. Nickie brought up a great opportunity for organizations that serve kids and families across the state. You have opportunities to invite individuals, elected officials, or candidates into your programs and let them see the work in real time and see you all in action to give them a good sense of what's actually happening within their communities, and also to get to know you all as as leaders in the community who are serving kids and families. So I think, Nickie, that's a great idea and option to really have a huge impact on that local level. So well, I hate to wrap this up. I know we can't keep talking, but I think we could probably talk for days about what's happening within our kids and families on our community level and across the state. But just from you all, any advice you'd give to folks who are new to advocacy or really unsure how to jump in? Like, what advice would you give folks to say, come on into the fold, or come on into the water's warm, jump on in? What would you tell folks to do? Nickie, would you, or Liz, go ahead.
Go
I was
ahead.
going to say exactly what Nikki said. Invite them. It doesn't have to be a political conversation. It doesn't have to be an issue forward conversation. It can just be, here's the work that we're doing. It can be relationship building first. Start in the interim when they are not, um, when their calendars aren't, crazy busy. They're not in the throes of session. It can just really be just showing them the work that you're doing, the value add that you have in their district and their community. And I think that that's a great start. The other advice that I would have, we worked with more of a grassroots group this session that wasn't as familiar with sort of the Frankfurt process and got very, very discouraged. And what I always tell people is that Frankfurt is a long game. Legislation is a long game. We worked on an issue, some legislation, the birth center legislation that took 5 years from the first time it was introduced to when it got passed. And so sometimes success or progress is really incremental. Sometimes it's getting a great bill sponsor. Sometimes it's just getting a committee hearing 1 year. Just don't get discouraged because it is sometimes there's a lot of turnover. Sometimes their priorities are elsewhere, and it's just not the right season or session for that particular issue. But it can take a long time to get good policy right, and just stick with it and keep building your coalition and your champions.
And I would just like to say that at FEC, we have a little saying that everyone can do something. And it's real easy to sit back and think that someone else is doing the something, but you are the someone. And while I look at, an example that I would use is, and I've reached out to Shannon about this, while Cayenne's law didn't pass, one of the things that we're looking at is how can we make that difference in our own little world? How can we train our law enforcement, and are they open to it? And we have some of those relationships that we're able to make some local change. So while you might get frustrated in the long game, if you will, there are things that you can do in your own area. And that's just one of those things that we will do.
Yeah, Nikki and Liz nailed it. It is a long game. There's a saying we use in Frankfurt, it takes 3 years minimum for a good idea to become law. Sometimes it takes a lot convincing for that to become a good idea. Sometimes what we may have is a good idea, but the political realities just aren't in its favor. So don't take any of this personally. This is a messy, complicated process. And it's designed to be like we're changing law. We're putting something into stone that's going to be shaping Kentuckians' lives for a long time. It's not supposed to be easy unless it's really, really clear. And let's be honest, some of the things we're working on aren't super clear to a lot of people, and they're foreign concepts. And most people never have to interact with the situation we're dealing with, but the policies we're pushing are really impactful to the people they're going to be affecting. So stick with it. Don't get disheartened. Don't give up. And just remember, you've got a good idea. You've got good legislators that are thinking about what's in your best interest and our best interest. And I would just assume the best and plan for the worst.
Solid advice from all three of you. Shane, Nickie, Liz, I am really grateful to work with you on a pretty regular basis, learn from you all, and I learn something new every time we connect in whatever capacity that we're in. So really grateful to have you all on today and to be part of this conversation. I will recommend to folks that we've got a couple of opportunities to learn more if you're interested. KYA has our 2026 bill tracker on our website. We also did a deep dive on the Kentucky General Assembly 26 budget and policy for kids and families on our blog. And then also we've got a voter guide on kids and the Kentucky primary. We are nonpartisan, but we can talk about what we'd like to see our candidates talk about and what those areas of focus could be. So highly recommend folks go check those out. Also would recommend go check out Metro United Way, Family Enrichment Center, and Roebling Solutions websites information. Go follow them on LinkedIn or wherever you like to follow folks. These folks are one incredibly knowledgeable in their areas of expertise, but also just good humans to get to know and be around. So appreciate y'all so much. Thanks for joining our webinar today and our recording today, and look forward to seeing y'all in a couple of weeks or months at upcoming Blueprint events. Thanks so much.